overwhelmed. That's the nicest introduction ever. Thank you so very much. So I want to start with a territorial acknowledgement for exactly, as you said, you described exactly where I am for our friends from other places, but I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of Saanich Nation. And the Saanich Nation is part of the Coast Salish peoples, but of course, like this conference, Saanich people transcend the fake international border. I have friends who are Sartlip First Nation, including our member of the Legislative Assembly in the northern part of this riding. Adam Olson is Sartlip, and he's got cousins and relatives on the U.S. side of the border because the whales don't notice the border, the salmon don't notice the border, the Sartlip First Nation. So I just want to greet you in the language spoken by the Wasanich people, which is different than it's related to languages spoken down towards Victoria. But just to say in Senchothan, Haishka, I raise my hands to you, Haishka Siem, which is a sign of honor, respect, greeting, welcome, and thanks. And I do want to thank you all for your work. Anita will know this, as we've talked about past, when I was with Sierra Club of Canada working out of the Ottawa office, we quite often met, at least, I don't know, often with Results Canada folks, because we were in shared campaigns. I remember, I think the first shared campaign where I was working with Results was on international financial institutions, the impact of structural adjustment programs, how to get more accountability. And there I came to know a really great volunteer with Results named Blaise Salmon, who, with another amazing connection, is the husband of the leader of the Green Party of British Columbia now, Sonia Furstenau. Not way back then, but now. Yay. So I'm grateful for your work, and I'm also honored that you would ask me to be a keynote speaker. And now this is embarrassing, Anita. I've forgotten how much time I'm supposed to take. I don't want to go too long. How are you doing? Is it 15?
You have until, sorry, I have to look at my other chart here, 10 a.m. But we're going to, 10 a.m., which is 1 o'clock your time, but we'd like to leave a few minutes at the end, 10 minutes, 15 at the end for questions.
Okay, you're not going to believe this. Okay, so I'm going to start with what time zone I'm in. We moved, and I'm so grateful to the Results organizers of this conference for being so very helpful, that when I was supposed to speak on a Saturday, we suddenly realized I had to fly to Ottawa for the budget, because the budget was announced. But guess what? I'm still here in Sydney because I couldn't get vaccinated in time. And we thought it would throw off the conference too much to call you back and say, okay, now we're changing it all up again. But I'm home in Sydney because I wasn't about to go through 4 airports with these variants running amok across Canada to head to Ontario, which at the moment is a hot spot, seems to be out of control. And it's devastating, just devastating that what we're all dealing with globally. But that's the focus of what you asked me to talk about. But I thought I'd let you know that it'll be 10 o'clock for me too. And I hope not to talk the whole time. I don't like doing that. Oh, I do. I as you can tell already, I'm digressing from my digression, which is one of my worst habits. But I want to focus on a few key things and then open it up to discussion, because that's the most useful thing. And I wouldn't mind at all. I'm very interested in hearing about the workshop that Sam described for later in the day. I think Sam or maybe John described of how to impact policymakers. I know you've already got an expert coming in to tell you, but I've been on both sides of that, right? As the Sierra Club coming in to talk to politicians, and now somebody who's been in Parliament for 10 years, and I get visits from virtually everyone. Strangely enough, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers doesn't come to meet with me, but everybody else does. So that's how that goes. The global pandemic has put us in, well, it's what I think of at the highest level of abstraction. If you really raise yourself up above this, where are we? We're at a hinge moment in history where things that weren't possible before are now possible. So yes, at the moment, it is not a good place to be. At the moment, we can feel a combination of terrified. We can feel all kinds of things. We can feel as though this feels unending. How do we can address the fact that when I stood up in Parliament, March 13th of 2020, imagine that, it was more than a year ago now. And on behalf of the Green Party, because I'm now the leader of the Parliamentary Caucus of Greens in Parliament. So although we have a new leader, by the way, I should mention Annemie Paul, who's fantastic, but she doesn't yet have a seat in Parliament. She, by the way, for U.S. friends, she's the first Black woman to lead a major political party in Canada, or I think actually any political party in Canada. But anyway, so Annamie's not in the House yet. So it falls to me to speak. And actually, March 13th, 2020, we were still in the leadership race. But I stood up on behalf of the Greens to give unanimous consent to the motion from the government that we should adjourn from March 13th till April 20th because of the pandemic. And believe it or not, I remember distinctly feeling as I stood up to speak to say, yes, the Greens give unanimous consent that we adjourn. In my head, I was thinking, till April 20th? Do we have to be away that long? It would never have occurred to any of us, and I don't think as individuals or as people in government, that we would be on April 18th, 2021, wondering if it would be safe to go back across the country to work, to be in Parliament for the budget. Nor would we have imagined that the Parliament of Canada, which is an institution that in terms of its use of technology is virtually unchanged since 1867, we leapt over the 19th century. We went right into the 21st century and almost have whiplash from it. We are now able to debate bills from Zoom. We are able to vote remotely. We are able to interject with points of order. Everything you can do parliamentarily, you can now do from your home office, wherever you are across the country, and some MPs in moving vehicles on their phones. We are able to work remotely when anyone who had proposed it as some sort of useful modernization measure, absent COVID, we would never have done it. So here we are. And for a while, we began to move from thinking about how we respond to COVID on an emergency basis. We began to think about how do we build back better? What do we do post-pandemic? And it's really hard right now to get citizens interested in the post-pandemic recovery when it's clear that we're in a third wave and have made, I have to say, horrifyingly little progress in understanding what we're dealing with from a public health point of view. And depending on what jurisdiction you're in, I have to say, the Atlantic Canadian bubble is the pride of Canada. And as a former Atlantic Canadian, part of me thinks, well, if it hadn't been that it was the Atlantic Canadians who were doing better than people in Ontario would have been prepared to notice it. There's a certain amount for our friends from the US of a kind of a cultural national prejudice that if it's coming from Atlantic Canada, it's got to be slow and stupid compared to Ontario. Well, now Ontario is begging Newfoundland and Labrador for vaccines. But the global perspective is the one I want to focus on, and what we can do post-pandemic and what lessons come out of COVID, because there will be many. The first thing, which is I think the most important thing, and I think it will stick, and I hope I'm right about this, is that neoliberalism is dead. In a public health emergency, at a moment when we had, by the way, who would have ever imagined governments being prepared to say, we're going to shut down our economies voluntarily and take a huge hit to our GDP because we have to save lives. We're going to tell you that we don't want stores open and we don't want people traveling. And that's and we're going to spend, at least in Joe Biden just got through the U.S. legislature, I think it was $1.5 trillion relief package. Canada has spent, for the size of our economy, a comparable amount. We are second only to Japan in how much money we've spent to help our citizens get through pandemic. In fact, average family income through pandemic across Canada has gone up. But when I say neoliberalism is dead, what I mean is that for anyone past my generation, and I'm one of the tail end of the boomers, where I was born in 1954. So it's occurred to me over the years that I'm in the last generation that has a sense of connection to the Second World War and the Depression. Because my parents told me the stories, my grandparents told me the stories. The idea that government could come to your aid, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. You could say that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as Lester Brown's wonderful book, There Is No Planet B, starts with the anecdote that Roosevelt told the big car makers, I need you to make tanks because we need to change our industrial strategy. We're going to need to gear up to fight Hitler. And the car makers said, we're making money selling cars, no thank you. At which point Roosevelt got through the US Congress a bill that made it illegal to make cars. And then he said, so you're making tanks. Now, neoliberalism is an aberration of democracy, and of course came out of the late 80s, Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, Maggie Thatcher, and of course here Brian Mulroney. But it was one of John Kenneth Galbraith's great lines about Milton Friedman is he said, the tragedy for Milton Friedman is that his ideas have been tried. So they fail. They fail monstrously. And Joseph Stiglitz has demonstrated this in many of his recent books. Neoliberalism is the notion of trickle-down economics, that if you make the billionaires richer, everybody else is better off, right? Or as Gus Speth, I'm quoting a lot of Americans here because we got US friends joining us, but Gus Speth, who was the former head of the UN Environment Program, UN Development Program, it was his great line, a rising tide lifts all yachts. So we look at this and say, what does it mean that neoliberalism is dead? And why do I say it? Well, because the billionaire class didn't save us. We may not be saved, but we're doing better than we would have been. I mean, obviously, economically, the programs that rolled out were really good. Our public health response to variants is leaving us worried. Well, I'll set that aside. But we know that without our government's response, quick response, some better than others, as I mentioned, the Atlantic provinces, famously New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, a lot of governments did better, but without government assistance, no one was saying at the beginning of COVID, when we rose to adjourn the House till April 20th, where's the private sector? We're saying, what is government going to do? So for many generations, or at least since the boomers, so all the kids of the 80s, the 90s, and the beginnings of this century, they have never seen government respond to anything in a way that showed a determination to make the world a better place or save people's lives. So that's why I feel it's a hinge moment in history where we can make a huge shifts in expectations of societies, huge shifts in programming, huge shifts in how we construct our economy. I've been calling for, through the vehicle of asking Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau to do it, the equivalent of a new Bretton Woods round of talks, because the Bretton Woods round of talks reorganized and restructured the global economy and set in place institutions that were supposed to prevent another depression from happening. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, all those institutions of that era, they're still there. But we need to rethink things to think about, well, what about modern monetary theory? If everybody does this together to make sure we all get out of a situation of debt, of deep deficit, if we protect ourselves with a global system of central bankers talking to each other such that no country sinks because they decided we're going to try a different system. I think the key change that we can make quickly is to reorganize the world trade system such that it reinforces and supports climate goals and goals of the Sustainable Development Goals to eliminate poverty by 2030. I mean, the SDG goals unite all social movements because nothing important is left out, and they're all agreed to by governments, and they're all due on 2030. What if we had a revisiting of the Uruguay round such that we would say, sorry, World Trade Organization, you can't stand in the way of climate action anymore. And it's quite a remarkable thing, and even most climate activists missed it. I had the benefit, I suppose, of not knowing how to say no to any issue or cause that's come my way for my whole life. So I've had experience in lots of different issues. And I'm one of the few in the climate movement who was also part of the movement to stop the multilateral agreement on investment, to try to stop TRIPS, stop the WTO. And here we are, we're talking about vaccines. What's in our way? TRIPS, right? The trade-related intellectual property systems within the Uruguay round, within the WTO. We've been demanding in Parliament as Greens for some time now that Canada push at the TRIPS discussions for an exemption such that vaccines that are currently copyrighted, now here's an outrage, vaccines that were developed by big multinational, big pharma with the benefit of tens of millions, if not billions of dollars of public funding from governments around the world, think they own that intellectual property and won't share it with the poorest of the poor. Don't get me going on big pharma. The words aren't parliamentary. So here we have an opportunity to think about, in a hinge moment, what changes. Okay, in the context of what I was saying about being both a climate activist and a trade activist, I was part of the Canadian, I was in the office of the Minister of Environment at the time we negotiated the Montreal Protocol. So I was involved in the negotiations to protect the ozone layer in 1986 and 87. And we signed the Montreal Protocol to save the ozone layer, and it worked. That's not module, by the way, that's Montreal. Montreal. So the Montreal Protocol to save the ozone layer, I shouldn't be reading the words that are going on below me there, sorry for levity. The Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer, excuse me. That's it. The Montreal Protocol worked remarkably well. We hit every target, industrialized countries, developing countries. And what we did was, if you're negotiating a global, legally binding environmental agreement, how do you enforce it? So in the negotiations for Montreal, governments around the world agreed that if any government that was a party to the treaty violated the terms of the treaty by, for instance, manufacturing chlorofluorocarbons again, or trading in them, using them against the terms of the treaty, every other country in the treaty could apply trade sanctions against them. In other words, we could kill your economy if you traded in chlorofluorocarbons. Now, 10 years isn't a big span of time in terms of global diplomacy or anything big changing. But 10 years later, because we signed the Montreal Protocol in September 1987, 10 years later, in December 1997, all the same governments, all the same countries gathered in Kyoto, Japan, to negotiate the binding specific parts of a treaty every government in the world had signed in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. And at the Rio Earth Summit, we signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, under which the world's governments are still operating. And all of what you hear about of individual COPs, conferences of the parties, I'm sure because you're in results, you follow all this stuff, so you know, but each one of those is essentially an annual Congress of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But in Kyoto, Japan, I remember the Canadian Environment Minister was Christine Stewart at the time, and the late Christine Stewart. She was a lovely person from Port Hope, Ontario. Anyway, Christine said before she went to negotiate, and I was horrified, this went out with Sierra Club of Canada, she said, if trade sanctions, this was the government of Canada position, if trade sanctions are included in the Kyoto Protocol, Canada will not sign. What happened in a 10-year span? We created the World Trade Organization, and the World Trade Organization formed a committee called the Committee on Trade and Environment. And it could have asked a very important question. Are there trade agreements that threaten the environment? As you can imagine, that's not the question they asked. They asked, are there multilateral environmental agreements that get in the way of trade? Oh my, there are. There's the Convention on the Trade of Endangered Species. There's this Montreal Protocol thing. There's a Basel Convention that bans the exportation of hazardous waste. So the Committee on Trade and the Environment didn't even make a ruling, but it became a topic that was hot enough that the environment ministers at every cabinet table all around the world, and I can't exactly prove this, but it must have been what happened. The trade ministers are always more powerful than the environment ministers. And the environment ministers were sent to Kyoto with specific instructions not to include any trade measures in the Kyoto Protocol. So if you want to know why every treaty to protect climate hasn't worked, it's because none of them have been enforceable with anything with teeth. So back to what we could do now, let's revisit the trade agreements. Let's think about, we don't want TRIPS to say that poor countries can't get generic drug access or access to vaccines when we're in a global crisis, this pandemic. We have COVAX, created by the World Health Organization to make sure poorer countries can get vaccines, but it's very clear that it's not working. Canada accessed some of those vaccines for us. This new term, vaccine nationalism, is catching on. Meanwhile, how do we ensure that we don't take our eye off the ball on ending global poverty? I was talking to one of my favorite friends and colleagues within the Global Greens movement, Carolyn Lucas, who's the only Green member of Parliament in the Palace of Westminster. And she said they're just outraged there because Boris Johnson has just cut development assistance. And she said, we'd achieved the 0.7% of GDP or GNI to overseas development assistance, but Boris Johnson has just cut it. And I said, Carolyn, you know that Canada is at 0.28%. We've never gotten close to what is, to our shame, a target set by our former Prime Minister and Nobel Peace Prize winner, Lester B. Pearson. He set the target while working for the United Nations, not working as our Prime Minister. But it's known as the Pearson target, that every country and every donor nation should ensure that 0.7% of their GNP goes to the poorest of the poor. And Canada is one of the laggards. I mean, I mentioned that the UK had hit it and is now cutting back, but some countries have hit 1%. They've exceeded the 0.7. So I really hope we can get that back on our global agenda in this post-pandemic period, where we have to refocus on every single one of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have to look at where are there institutional multilateral barriers, obstacles to us doing what needs to be done. And if it's not post-pandemic, it certainly won't happen. We are in Canada in an active discussion with the majority of individual members of Parliament and the majority of individual members of Parliament, and based on how their members have voted at conventions. We recently came out of 2 conventions for 2 of the bigger parties, the Liberals and the New Democrats, and they've finally adopted a policy that Greens have had for decades, which is that we need a guaranteed livable income. So that means the majority of MPs in Parliament, if not their party official policies, want a guaranteed livable income. It's phenomenal support. In Prince Edward Island, where the government is currently a minority parliament that needs the support of the Greens, that there are the official opposition, that PEI has actually adopted a policy that they want to move to guaranteed livable income now, and they've asked the federal government for partnership money to get it going, to see how it works. So these are big changes that one can imagine we could make, that actually, post-COVID, we should be able to say we're never going back to what we thought was quote unquote normal. It wasn't right to warehouse our seniors in places where they'd be locked down and neglected. And I don't need to take on any details for that for Canadian friends, but for American friends, they sent the army in because seniors were in unspeakably horrific conditions in beds that hadn't had any change of linens, and people just left in their own feces, and unhelped and unchanged, and bandages, and just they had sent the army in because these privately run long-term care homes were failing at the most basic level of care. Things aren't going to go back to what people thought was normal. I'm sure of it. So how do we take that to the issues that matter to results? I think we number one, we should stop a lot of NGOs, not so much results, but I find a lot of people in the environmental movement, a lot of people even in the development movement, have adopted a kind of fatalism that amounts to incrementalism. It doesn't tell people in power or in office, we're not in power, we're just in office and we're servants, doesn't tell them what's needed, tries to look as if we're sophisticated political operatives within environmental groups and think, okay, what could we get really? Shouldn't ask for what's necessary. If we ask for what's necessary, politicians will balk. This is not the time for incrementalism. Right? This is a time to be absolutely clear of what must be done, because we're not going to get a second chance, not on climate. We have months only, not years, to ensure that we take the advice of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and reduce emissions to a level that gives us a prayer of holding on to 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase, without which we don't have a lot of confidence in that human civilization survives to mid-century. Human beings as a species have a good chance of surviving, but we won't have anyone to call if we need 911, so we need to make sure we actually hold on to human civilization, functional nation states. Blowing by 1.5 probably means blowing by 2, blowing by 3, blowing by 4 to 5. Now, when you get to the area of like 7 or 8 global average degrees Celsius global average temperature increase, then you're actually talking about massive die-offs and extinctions that could include us. But that's the worst case scenario of which no one wants to speak. And there's no reason we shouldn't be obsessed by that to the point of despair, although I struggle. Oh boy. But praise the Lord. Sorry for speaking of the Lord on a Sunday, but praise the Lord that our friends south of the border didn't relieved the globe of the cancerous lesion known as Donald Trump. So we are very grateful, very, very grateful. And Joe Biden has shown such leadership that I think it's left Canadian politicians in a state of shock. I mean, the fact that the Canadian Parliament, that there were only, okay, I know I'm talking about Greens too much. I'm not partisan really, but it was a shocker to me that only the three of us Green MPs voted against an emergency motion brought forward by the Conservatives, that because Joe Biden was such a threat to Canada, we need a special committee to deal with Canada-U.S. relations, hashtag Keystone Pipeline. Holy mackerel. I mean, the three of us as Green MPs were shocked when everyone else voted. We kept saying, why is this an emergency now that you think President Joe Biden is a threat to Canadian interests and Donald Trump wasn't? They never brought forward any motion in Parliament, not any party, that when Trump was applying tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum and saying that we were a security threat, or when he said that the N95 masks manufactured by 3M could not be exported to Canada, none of this was considered a threat to Canada, like canceling the Keystone Pipeline. And you get all the other parties lined up to say, oh, we have to have an emergency. We have to have a committee that deals with the threat of Joe Biden. And so I just want to say, I regret very much that Canada's first meeting with President Joe Biden, who, after all, as I said about campaign promises being kept, he'd been clear. John Kerry was Secretary of State when Keystone was first turned down based on a voluminous environmental assessment. I think I'm the only Canadian who read it. It's fantastic work on why the Keystone Pipeline would increase greenhouse gases. And there's a longer answer about that, and I'm going to not get into it because I won't have time for questions. But John Kerry is an evidence-based person. And when Joe Biden appointed him as a special national security advisor on climate, okay, they're going to be serious. And so I wasn't surprised when on President Joe Biden's first day in office, he signed an executive order to cancel the Keystone Pipeline. And I was in touch with people in the PMO, and I said, look, when Trudeau calls him, he should say, okay, good for you. I'll see you and raise you one. We're canceling TMX. But no, this response that we should be in shock and horror that, God forbid, a newly elected, of any level of government, a newly elected person should dramatically and decisively keep a campaign promise. No wonder the Liberals were in shock. They've never seen such a thing. So we have a really important moment coming up this week. It's on Earth Day, and I'm so grateful. I mean, I know that the Democratic Party mainstream lets people down over and over again. I've got friends, very dear friends in the Greens across the United States, and I know that that the U.S. is hampered both by the perverse voting system we have in Canada, first past the post. The U.S. has the same system, made even more perverse by the Electoral College. But my God, I'm impressed so far with what Joe Biden is doing. And he's done the world an enormous favor by putting a holding feet to the fire moment for 40 countries around the world and their elected leaders, or not elected in the case of the People's Republic of China and some others. But he's holding this climate summit on Thursday. It's terribly important. The Conference of the Parties, COP26, that was supposed to have happened in Glasgow fall of 2020 was, of course, canceled because of COVID. We're running out of time in reality. Like, there's a carbon budget, and every day, every week, every month that goes by, we'll have a harder time staying to within manageable band of a hospitable climate for this whole planet. And at the same time, we have the many, many crises of social justice, human dignity, loss of biodiversity from things other than climate change, like cutting down all our old growth forests and all that. So there's a lot that we need to deal with. But Joe Biden has done the world a favor by creating a moment that would not have been there otherwise. An April 22nd, 2021, holding feet to the fire moment to say that the collectivity of all the climate targets adopted by every government around the world, even if they were fully realized, are about half of what needs to be done, and we need to do it quickly. So I'm deeply grateful to talk to all of you who are committed to getting results and who so passionately believe that democracy works. And I'd be very happy to answer any questions and open up discussion. So you don't have to ask a question if you have a comment. I'm optimistic right now, and that takes one heck of a leap of faith, or maybe serious degrees of delusion, but I'll take it because I have grandkids and I am not giving up. And we have a chance in the next 10 days. And I hope everybody's, emailing, phoning Justin Trudeau. Well, I mean, most Canadians are focused on the budget that comes out tomorrow. But we have to see our governments. Trudeau has said he will announce a new climate target. We have to remind them when we get past that moment of the new climate target, we have to actually do it, which means canceling pipelines, banning fracking, doing some things that this government doesn't want to do because it likes to do things that make everybody happy. Climate measures that'll make people happy, and more subsidies for fossil fuels so the industry won't be mad. The cognitive dissonance of this kind of governing, cognitive dissonance, I do think, is a mental health crisis, because it really must hurt your head to simultaneously hold two such oppositional notions as the pipeline must be built and we're climate leaders. But they somehow do both. Anyway, I'm going to tell you I'm optimistic right now because of things that are shifting. And a lot of the shift is at that big level. We weren't out on our porches banging our pots and pans to celebrate the billionaires. We were not on our porches banging our pots and pans to say, oh, good, the commercial banks are making more money than ever during pandemic. Yay, banks. We were out there for our frontline healthcare workers. And we can't let them down. We can't ever, post-pandemic, let the issues of economic inequity, social justice, climate emergency, ecosystem collapse, and the need for structural institutional change to ensure that the structures, institutions, and policies of governments are no longer aligned with expanding corporate profits and spawning billionaires, but with reducing the gap in terms of equity in our society to the maximum amount. Yes, we all want healthy economic activities, but it must be grounded in resilience, healthy communities, and taking care and, in fact, loving each other. So I'll stop there.
Wow. Capital letters, passion. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We have some questions in there, and one of the people in our results fellowship will be guiding them to you.
Hello, MP May. My name is Jaya, and I am a results fellow. I'll be asking questions today, but I just wanted to say, when I was a high school student at Esquimalt High School, I remember you coming to our school. And what I would love to say is that you made all of the students, and one thing we often feel is it's hard to be optimistic. It's hard to feel like you can really do anything. And you always left our school invigorated and empowered. So thank you for that.
Daisy, that must have been quite some time ago. And I don't think that that didn't come right with your name. Did you say Jaya?
Yes, Jaya.
I think I remember meeting you. I'm pretty sure. Didn't we meet?
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. God love you. Thank you. And I remember the first time I spoke at Esquimalt High School. I really lost it. I don't remember what I did or said, but I think I even made myself cry. Anyway, Jeb, it was the first day I met Mark Neufeld from Claremont High School.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And Rick Cool was on the panel from Royal Road. I think that was the time.
You might remember better than I do, honestly. It was a while ago for me too. So now I've got some questions here in the chat, and I'd like to start with Tom's here. He says, as an American, I am so pleased by your willingness to be open and frank in your comments. I'm not used to hearing that kind of communication here in the US. How do you hold your political career and actually move up the ladder?
It's lucky because in the Green Party, there isn't a ladder. There's kind of a horizontal platform. We're a party that's committed to grassroots democracy. So, and when I say this, I'm not just pumping up Canadian Greens. I love the Green Party globally because we all adhere to 6 core green values. They're actually refined from a document I'd love to recommend to all of you if you haven't ever read it. It's called the Earth Charter. And the first time that, because Greens were popping up all around the world, and the first time that they met globally was in Australia in probably around 1998, and the Earth Charter had just been accepted. So they took the Earth Charter goals and refined them down to 6 core values. So when you're in a party that doesn't believe in top-down power and authority, but believes in grassroots democracy, the leader you don't climb any ladders. Now, how do you hold yourself true to who you are in politics? And I say this is something for both the U.S. to consider and Canadians and people in every democracy. And I'll confess to our U.S. friends that I was born in Hartford, Connecticut. My parents moved to Cape Breton Island on the east coast of Canada in 1970, early 1973, right around the time my mother was named on Nixon's enemies list. So that was one of her. I mean, I have the Officer of the Order of Canada. My mother was on Nixon's enemies list. So you talk about high honor. That was like, so what? But I grew up in U.S. politics, and when I grew up in U.S. politics, you had such a thing as independent, peacenik Republicans, right? You had people, you had right-wing Democrats, you had left-wing Republicans. You did not see this block voting by party. Now, the same thing is true in Canada. When our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, who's not laudable in many respects, but I love this quote because party politics didn't matter that much. And John A. Macdonald referred to his caucus as quote unquote loose fish. You never knew where they were going to vote or what they were going to do. And so what was the name of that? I mean, you Americans, you'll help me remember the name of the wonderful Oregon Republican, Mark. Who was yes, thank you. He was so wonderful. And I met him once. I met Al Gore's father in that same area. I mean, we'd go down. My mother was, never mind. We're going to why I knew all these people. But Mark Hatfield, you didn't see the power of organized political parties exerting control over what politicians did. That's why people have to watch what they say, because they're being marked and graded, not by their voters, but by these quite unwell, pathologically evil people who have no job except killing other parties so that they can win. They no longer care about why they're winning. It's just they want to win. They want power for its own sake, and they forget what they want to do when the election's over. We really need to dismember political parties and the power they have over the people who get elected while carrying that banner, regardless of nation, because that's what holds down individually. Because to get elected to parliament and then check your brain at the door because your party tells you how to vote. I mean, I'm quite sure when I mentioned that story that only Paul Manley, Jenica Atwin, and I voted against the idea that we were in a crisis because Joe Biden is such a threat to Canada. I'm quite sure that asked individually to Gord Johns, who's a fellow NDPer and a dear friend of mine who's here on Vancouver Island, I think if I'd asked Gord, don't you think this motion is Looney Tunes? He would have said, yeah, this is craziness. We didn't have a motion like this against Trump. But he voted for it because you vote the way you're told to vote in all the other parties except the Greens. And that's when I think, okay, we have to help people. And believe it or not, this would be a great campaign for results. We have to help the average congressperson, MP, senator to be free to speak their own mind and vote as their conscience tells them they should vote. I mean, the fact that Obama was treated to the Republicans opposing everything he wanted to do, no matter what, that's the control of the back room over. There must have been a few intelligent people in that crowd that voted the way they were told. Where was their sense of principle and ethics and personal responsibility? We have to get that balance back, because political parties are. I mean, I think democracy would work much better without any political parties at all. But you need to get political parties to agree to that, and I don't see any signs that they're ready for a suicide pact. So we need to control them and reduce their power.
Speaking of that, of restoring that balance and of and moving away from that party and giving our representatives the ability to speak as they think, as we see a presidentialization of the prime minister and concentration of power in the prime minister's office, how can we as constituents, as results volunteers and people, engage with our decision makers and shape policy outside of election?
Well, thank you. I think I'll be maybe a minority within the opposition members who think that Justin Trudeau has reduced the power of the Prime Minister's office as compared to Stephen Harper. But that was an unbelievable concentration of power. The Prime Minister's office doesn't exist in our Constitution. As I said, it's lucky being old enough to have known people. A dear friend of mine was Tom Kent, who I got to know when I was running a restaurant in Cape Breton Island, and he was the head of the Cape Breton Development Association, never mind, but DevCo, Cape Breton Development Corporation, it was a Crown corporation to help little businesses like ours. But Tom Kent was the principal secretary to Lester B. Pearson. So I actually know that when Lester B. Pearson was prime minister, the prime minister's office was a handful of stenographers and some secretaries. Pierre Trudeau our current prime minister's father, invented the prime minister's office as a central control, but pretty light, coordination, so that he wouldn't get the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Health having a press conference to announce something big on the same day. They became aware that the work of governing had changed because of the presence of media and cameras and so on. We can do a lot of things to reduce the power of the prime minister's office. One is to reduce the power of every party's leader to exert punishments over their members. So just one example is that the Elections Act requires that the leader's signature for every political party be on the nomination forms for leaders, for every candidate rather. We could get rid of that. We could say that the local decisions of the local democratically elected, what we used to call riding association, electoral district association, they are the ones who decide who runs, not the leader. Removing that penalty and threat function that was, and I'd say it was the law of unintended consequences. They put that in, by the way, in 1970, because up till 1970 in Canada, the name of a candidate's political party, that affiliation, was not on the ballot. It was just their name and address. So there's a longer history there. We can make that a campaign. Michael Chong, who's now Erin O'Toole's critic on foreign affairs, but as a independent conservative member when Harper was prime minister, he very bravely put forward a reform measure that would have removed that power from the leader of every party and would have removed the power of the leader. Every other, and I'm sorry for this for people from the States, because this won't apply in the States at all, but every other Commonwealth nation with constitutional monarchy and a Westminster parliamentary system of government, the caucus of elected members of parliament can change their leader. The caucus says, okay, well, Margaret Thatcher to John Major, right? So same thing in Australia recently. Only in Canada, of all the constitutional monarchies within the Commonwealth, is it the case that the caucus can't get rid of the leader, only a convention can. So that's part of us kind of absorbing by osmosis some US culture, the big convention, the razzle dazzle. So only the members of the party can change the party's leader. What Michael Chong's motion would have allowed the members of the caucus to at least say, we are requesting a leadership review. And this, by the way, isn't a change in any of the laws of the nation. This is just the laws of essentially the private clubs, non-governmental associations known as political parties. Making it an issue, by the way, just educating people on our system of government would be a great start, because a lot of Canadians and our news media treat elections as though there's a ballot somewhere that says Justin Trudeau, Erin O'Toole, Yves-François Blanchet, Jagmeet Singh, Annamie Paul. There's no such ballot. Annamie Paul's name is on one ballot, and it's in Toronto Centre. Justin Trudeau's name is on one ballot, and it's in Papineau. But these distinctions actually matter, but most Canadians don't know about them because we've allowed, and this is provincial jurisdiction, but we've allowed civics education in our schools to be virtually non-existent. So, I shouldn't rant about it too much because I'm sure there's more questions, but please do take it on board as a big challenge for results. One easy step is just to demand that in every budget, the office for the Prime Minister of Canada, that the office budget be cut in half. That'd be a good start.
So, and a really good question here from Sam, dovetailing on that. And I'd like to combine this with Patsy with your question is, are Canadian politicians listening to our lobbying on development issues? How are we going to communicate with them on getting that TRIPS waiver right now? And how can we make sure that gets across to Parliament, that happens?
Yeah, they are listening. The changes, I have to say, our Minister for International Development totally gets it. I know I'm being recorded and I'm sharing things with you that are a bit private, but Karina Gould could be one of us just sitting around the table talking and as passionate as anything. I tell you, when we were, during pandemic, the relations between someone like me as a former leader of a very small opposition party and the ministers of the Crown, I've had more access to everybody important in decision making during pandemic than before, and the access was better at the beginning because everybody was suddenly working from home, and it suddenly dawned on me that the ministerial gatekeepers were also working from home and not able to keep me from talking to ministers. I saw an article in the Guardian one afternoon working from home about the looming food crisis that will hit the planet because of pandemic, the ongoing knock-on effects of increased poor and the food crisis. And I just, in a, not a well thought out, not a proper letter on stationery, just an email, I wrote Karina. So I want to make sure you see this article about the world food crisis. We've got to increase our aid. And I heard from her in 15 minutes. She said, I saw that article too. I just came out of a World Food Program conference. We're working on it. We got to get going. So the minister's on board, which wasn't the case in previous governments. So the minister's on board. How much attention can she get around a cabinet table where everybody needs more? I hope a lot. I think I know that Chrystia Freeland is, relatively speaking, and I don't want to make this all about individuals, but it is often about individuals. Chrystia Freeland is much more on board than Bill Morneau would have been. I mean, Bill Morneau's notion of how you fight world poverty isn't to increase Canadian overseas development assistance. It's for him, in his multiple millions of dollars, to be very generous and help We Charity build schools. Right? There's different models for how we handle this. And it's not to say that Bill Morneau lacks compassion or didn't think he was doing the right thing, but he was the goddamn finance minister, and he should have increased international development assistance and the money that Canada's prepared to put into it. I don't know what Chrystia Freeland will do, but I'm really, really hoping that in tomorrow's budget, we see increased assistance. On the TRIPS agreement, there's a lot of support across party lines. There's a lot of backroom, and the Liberal caucus is a much less fear-filled place than was Harper's caucus. Now that's where some real conversation happens. It's behind closed doors, and I'm sure you all know this, where the individual members of Parliament for the Conservative Party meet with their leader, and we meet, our small caucus meets. But when the Liberal backbenchers are meeting with the party, they get things moved. They do make a difference, and I know we've got advocates and supporters in there. It makes people outraged to imagine that big pharma is not willing to share vaccines so that they can be manufactured generically in countries around the world. So I think one thing that does help is not just focusing on the individual politicians, but getting more information, education to Canadians, things like letters to the editor and opinion pieces. Oxfam did a great job the other day in their release on the issues around some poor countries don't look to be getting vaccines till 2024. I mean, a lot of Canadians may only be interested in that, self-interested when they think, oh, but I planned on going on a vacation there. We got to get those vaccines everywhere because we're not safe if we don't have vaccines everywhere. But I think people you're making a difference for sure. Educating individual MPs does matter, but educating Canadians so the individual MPs know they have cover when they go to their political higher ups to say, this is a matter of global ethical responsibility. And by the way, it's a really good vote getter. If you can say, and by the way, it's a really good vote getter, your chances of getting it acted upon are much better.
I'm good. I think thank you for that answer, MP May. It was a delight to hear from you.
Jaya, call me Elizabeth, for heaven's sakes. God, sorry. I've never been good with titles, and MP May just sounds so strange. I wouldn't mind, of course, being Prime Minister, Anita, but at my chat, I need Annamie Paul to be Prime Minister. I just want to be a member of Parliament again and keep working. So, Jaya, you were going to say something, and I interrupted you. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I think Anita, we're at time, so I'll pass it off to Anita for our closing.